So let's review a little. What was your favorite part, or what impressed you most about the Garden of Gethsemane?
This probably has nothing to do with anything, but it probably had a lot of history at that time. I know there's a lot of really old trees there now, but even the time of Jesus, they had been in that area for a few hundred years. I don't remember how many, but several hundred years by then.
Yep.
And it was probably an olive garden before they got there, because everybody grew olives.
Yep. Martin?
The Lord's Christ showing his humanity.
Okay.
It's like, it's almost the first time he was betrayed was, the guys all fell asleep and didn't betray him. That was almost the first betrayal.
The weakness of Peter, James, and John.
It was also a place that everybody that knew him or was around him, like Judas, knew that he went there often. But of course, he went there often when he was in the woods. He wasn't from there, of course.
Yep.
When he was there for the special Passover, he spent a lot of time there, and everybody knew it.
Seems like, some of my favorite pictures, I guess, that painted in my mind are a quiet place, reflecting on the idea of going to your closet and pray to God from the Sermon on the Mount. The intensity of the prayer, though we have very little of it recorded, we see the intensity as he states his spirit is being troubled so tremendously. Luke's record of the blood on the brow, or what semblance of blood on the brow, offers the intensity of what he was going through. It impresses me a little bit about not only the enormity of the situation, but that God sent angels to support him in that situation. I've often wondered, we're going to see again tonight something about angels, but I wonder how they presented themselves. It doesn't tell us, Was he the only one that could see them? Did he just feel them? What was the nature of it? That's kind of an interesting sideline, I guess, of the beauty of what takes place in the garden. Some of the things that we talked about when it came to what he had to say, we just need to remind ourselves that in spite of his humanity, and obviously that was a portion of what he was lamenting and praying about, his strength is also clearly seen in display there. I like that part of the garden. We're going to see that as well as we introduce our next section, 159, in the actual betrayal itself. We have Judas, who has consented to do this. He has given them a sign. We're going to see that in this particular instance. We're also going to see from the four Gospels, which all four record this particular section, we're going to be able to see clearly the events that take place in the garden as they come to take them away. So we're going to talk about that a little bit as we get into our next section. So let's pick up in Matthew chapter 26, verse 47 and 48. At the end of one of the Gospels, it says, "And the betrayer then came," and here in Matthew chapter 26, verse 47, it starts out by saying, "While he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, 'The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him.'" I think I have more questions that are unanswered than I have what the text actually tells me. And I guess that's by design. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John help a little bit, but there's so many questions you could ask. Did they not know what he looked like? I mean, it's a funny question that I ask. I don't have an answer for that. The idea of coming with swords and clubs, we're going to see Jesus respond to that idea a little bit in just a minute as you go along. We've got Judas, one of the 12, one of his own, coming and doing it as planned and predicted and prophesied in this scene. We have a sign that was arranged, the one I kiss, a typical Jewish greeting. We even have passages, of course, in the New Testament that says greet each other with the holy kiss, illustrating the common greeting of a friend in this setting. Kind of interesting to find that such a person that is so unfriendly is going to use a friend's kiss to betray him in this type of a setting. So that's kind of also something that's kind of interesting to me in this. We have we see here that two sets of people are actually mentioned, the chief priests and the elders of the people, but we're also going to see in one of the records as we go through it that there were also some of the guards of the temple court that were there. So we have quite a crowd that come about. It says actually that it was a great crowd, so we're talking probably hundreds in this picture. Most commentators say that word illustrates a large number like that came to take him away. They were bringing swords and clubs. What did they expect is another question that I ask. Here you got 12 lonely little apostles out in the middle of the garden, and they're coming with clubs and swords, and what did they expect to find? I really don't know. Maybe they expected a greater resistance. May well be true, but we don't know that either. Martin?
Well, the whole thing is, first of all, his kingdom's not of the world, so his people aren't fighting for him. They were a little mistaken themselves.
Oh, yeah.
He knew that they weren't. The reason he had the swords is so he could heal the high priest's son's ear. That was what that was about.
Very much so. We're going to see that as we unfold as well. We'll make some assertions about why some of the events take place as well. And they came up to Jesus and at once and said, "Greeting, Rabbi," and he kissed him. And Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you came to do." And they came up and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. So we have Judas performing his kiss, greeting him as teacher, the word rabbi. And interestingly, Jesus considered him a friend. And I find that striking in this particular situation. So he still calls him friend in this. Recognizing what he came to do, Jesus reads his heart. This is very typical of Jesus. We've seen this a great deal in this latter part of his ministry, where he's always over-speaking them because he's reading what they're saying or what they're thinking. And so they didn't really have an opportunity to be authentic in what they're saying because he already knew what they were going to say. And of course, he has a response already planned and set in place for not only the crowd, but for Judas and the whole, you come do what you plan to do. It was part of the plan. He knew it and accepted it that way. I can only imagine, because the text, again, there's a little allusion to it. I think it's in Mark when we read it. But I can only imagine this kind of took Judas by a little aback. You know, we're going to see that a little bit, especially in John, that the power displayed by Christ is significant in this scene. And only John tells us that there was a great deal of power actually displayed here in this picture. But we're going to see that in our harmony as well as we go along. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then should the scripture be fulfilled that it must be so?" let's back to 51 again. So behold, one of those who were with him. We know by John it is Peter. Most commentators say the reason why Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not name him is because it would have been evidence against him if he had been arrested. At the time when Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written, they were written early enough in the writings that could have been a great concern. By the time John writes, which would have been way later on, it's no longer a concern. So not only does he tell us it's Peter, but he also tells us who the high priest's son boy was, Marcus. So we have both of these disclosed by John. We'll read those when we get closer to it. Matthew does not record the healing. Mark does. So we have, we know, because I'm sure you've read ahead or at least have known the story, that Jesus heals this man's ear. It's not spoken in Matthew's account that actually occurred. We'll talk a little bit more about why in a moment. Then Jesus said to him, put to the person, in this case knowing it's Peter, put your sword away. Kind of interesting, people have done all kinds of funny things with this passage against self-defense. Notice he says, put it away. He doesn't say, throw it away, or this type of thing. No, Peter was not right in what he did, but it was predictable. Was Peter acting out what he had promised? He promised he would die with Jesus. And I would venture to say that by this act, he meant what he said. He was willing to fight for the Lord. And yet, of course, that was not the plan, and the plan is going to be unfolded differently than that. But Peter acted out as he said. His word was good, because by cutting the priest's servant, took a blank. By cutting the servant, that was a criminal offense. And so, because it is the high priest's servant, that could have been very serious for Peter. And Peter knew the seriousness of taking such action. Not only the fact that it took place, but that Jesus then, of course, chastises him. Maybe we put a little emphasis on this part, which we should anyway. Those who take the sword will perish by it might offer several different viewpoints. One is, of course, the idea of these were the legal officials. They came to do what they were to do legally, and so Jesus chastises that. The next thing, of course, being that the fact that Peter was not conducting himself the way the Lord would have him necessarily in this picture, so he chastised a little bit about that. The perishing by the sword may be actually an authentic statement that if he had gotten by with this, or if it had escalated, then they might have all perished by the swords. They had swords with them and clubs with them. They expected a riot, it appears, in some way or another. So you almost get the impression by what it says earlier that the officials expected there to be a fight. And so they brought swords and clubs. A little later we see lamps. They can see what's going on in one of the records. And so they apparently expected there to be some kind of resistance. The only resistance, of course, is Peter doing this, and Jesus stops it right there. Now, Martin already brought out the idea there's a purpose for this. We're going to see that in one of the other records. But in the same picture, we find that Peter's a very authentic person up to this point, and we see him actually acting out what he had claimed. Interesting statement in 53. Did Jesus ever consider calling the angels? Kind of interesting, by the way he states this, it almost appears that it was a consideration. He says, hey, if I ask the Father, I can have 12 legions of angels here right away, And it's obviously an authentic statement. So if this event was not to transpire, Jesus sure didn't need Peter cutting anybody's ear off or them defending themselves. If he needed defense, he has all the defense he needs. How powerful is one angel? I mean, we have a few in the Old Testament. Just one angel goes to the defense of great armies. And he has all the power behind him that God needs to have behind an angel. Just one angel. Can we imagine even for a moment what 12 legions of them would have been able to perform if the Lord had asked them to wipe everyone off the face of the planet. It wouldn't have been outside of their ability to do so. But how then should the Scripture be fulfilled that it must be so? So Jesus' reliance is on his cognitive ability to not only understand that that was not the plan, but that it was in line with what had already been prophesied and what God had already put into play, which he was a part of creating. So would he have called the angels? Nope, because he knew the plan. The plan is clear. Could he have? That's a different question. Obviously, they were at his disposal. Part of the discussion he had with God. Maybe part of the, if we play with the extended discussion of let this cup pass, maybe this was part of the discussion. Well, you've got 12 legions at your disposal if you need them. There was no need because he was going to carry it out. John.
Not too long before this I always wondered, if Jesus had said to them, this is sell what you can and get swords.
Yeah.
And then they said, well, we have two. He said, that's enough.
Yeah.
So, I always wondered about that. He said for them to get swords, but he knew they weren't going to need them. He knew.
True. Yep.
I consider too that the one who carried the sword knew how to use it,
Yeah.
and that these are lawless times, and from the place of the house upper river and to the Golgotha could have been prevented by some other reason.
Yeah.
And it was dark, so this made a lot of
Sure.
need for self-protection in that sense.
There's also, which we'll get to as we get into Mark a little bit, there's also the question of who was going to be arrested. It is my understanding from the 4 Gospels that the intent was to arrest them all. And so the 12 were likely under sentence as well in some way or another. But that was not the plan of God, of course. So we have unfolding events that are also going to spare the 12, or the 11, because Judas is not spared, but the 11, and they, of course, flee according to Scripture, which we're going to see one of the records actually records for us. At that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, have you come out against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But all this has taken place, that Scripture of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples left him and fled. All right, so this is Matthew's final thought on the account. Notice Jesus addresses this crowd who have their swords and their clubs and are all ready to take them by force. And he brings out the prediction that the disciples would leave. Other accounts actually give us some insight into how this transpired that Matthew simply does not cover at all in this. So we'll continue on in Mark, and we'll come back to this idea as we get a little bit farther. The quotation that Jesus is using is found in Zechariah 13:7. Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, against the man who stands next to me, declares the Lord of hosts. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. I will turn my hand against the little ones. Indicating from this that the hand was turned against the apostles as well, yet the shepherd was able to protect them to that point, and he, of course, they are scattered, he is taken. So we have this, the striking of the shepherd. Mark's account, 14:43. And immediately while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Notice that we have all 3 aspects of the leadership represented: chief priests, scribes, and elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign saying, the one I will kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away under guard. So basically it tells us almost exactly what Matthew recorded for us. And when he came, he went up to him and said to him, Rabbi, and he kissed him. And they laid hands on him and seized him. But one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said to them, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs and capture me? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me, but let the Scriptures be fulfilled. And they all left him and fled. And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him. But he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. So now we have John Mark, who records this for us. One of the most interesting aspects of this is only what is in addition that Mark puts in here that the other three do not record. It is about this young man who is seized and runs away naked into the dark. Almost every commentary I read says this is John Mark himself. And he is then writing an eyewitness account of what transpired. It also suggests that he was a follower of Jesus, so there may have been others there besides the 11 that had continued following. And it says they seized him, so it illustrates the idea that they were interested in more than just Jesus in the garden when they began to seize this young man here. You almost get the picture that they grabbed onto his linen cloth and it came off of him and he was able to escape. So he ran into the dark. Nothing else is said, and there's actually no exact evidence that it's John Mark, except that he's the one that records this. Matthew, Luke, and John say nothing of this young man whatsoever in their record. So most people seem to think that it probably is him, and he had an eyewitness account of what transpires here. Luke's account. He was still speaking there, came a crowd, and the man called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He drew near to Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? Luke comes at it maybe from a little bit different angle, and it offers a little bit maybe more insight into some of the questions being asked. Jesus has a little bit more conversation with Judas than Matthew and Mark actually record for us. If you look at Matthew and Mark closely, there's room for this discussion, but it's just simply not recorded by them. So we have the kiss being mentioned. Are you coming and kissing me as a friend? Well, Jesus called him a friend afterwards, according to Matthew. So we have maybe a little discourse between him and Judas himself. Would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? I would suggest that this was stated for Judas's benefit, particularly because Judas had the evidence that he was the Son of Man. And he is God, and he was there the whole time. He is betraying him on purpose in this setting. So we have this little conversation that takes place. And when those who were around him saw what would follow, they said, Lord, shall we strike with a sword? So now we have Luke also recording the fact that there was a statement made by the two that obviously had swords, shall we strike? And before Jesus could even answer, if we follow the dialogue fairly closely with Luke, one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. So we have then Jesus responding, no more of this. So before he could respond, they asked, before he could respond, Peter takes the initiative, and in doing so, Jesus then responds, no more of this. And he touched his ear and healed him. Now Luke records for us what Matthew and Mark do not. That by the instantaneous reaction of Peter, we have the instantaneous reaction of Jesus, and the ear is totally healed.
I think of interest that he cut off his right ear. That meant with the man with the sword had to strike him with his left hand.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Martin?
And not only that, we're going back to his ability. If he was not good with that sword, he'd have cut the man's shoulder.
Yeah. Likelihood he was aiming for his head, so it was, John?
He wasn't that good.
There's two things there that it seems like would make most people sit and take notice. One was Jesus said that here in this one, he says, Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? And boy, I walk up to the Son of God and he says that to me, I would think twice.
I would think so. Yeah. So there was a little confrontation there that I would say probably initiated the next scene that we'll see with Judas, and that is his remorse and then his killing himself. So part of the conversation that transpires here did affect him. Unfortunately, it didn't affect him the way it would have been hoped to in that sense.
And the other thing was, of course, they were out to get Jesus because he was Jesus.
Right.
Otherwise, when he healed this man's ear, they would have thought, hey, this guy's somebody special. Maybe we shouldn't be doing this.
Trying to find, if you will, reason to get the apostles as well would have been, wouldn't it have been much more lucrative, I guess, for the high priest and them to have captured them all? They could have easily then kept all this in one big batch at one setting. Obviously, that was not the plan, but and so Jesus forced that. We're going to see how he does that in a minute in one of the records. But we have this picture of them escaping, if you will, and the next thing we have them back together again elsewhere, a little bit later on. So we have that all part of the scene unfolding. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and officers of the temple and elders. Notice here Jesus says the officers of the temple, that would have been the temple guard. So not only did they solicit people from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders, but also the officers of the temple guard, which would have been, and seasonal, if you will, in protecting the temple court itself, who had come out against him. Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you day after day in the temple, and you did not lay hands on me, but this is your hour, and the power of darkness. This statement in 53 really kind of brings it home. When I was with you I was there all the time. You remember back whenever it was spoken that they wanted to seize him, do you remember why they didn't?
He disappeared.
On some occasion he disappeared, but on one occasion there was something else. Afraid of the people. He'd been preaching to the people, and they were afraid of the people. So here they have a nice private setting, you see, where they don't have to be afraid of the people. And they've got everybody that's there is on their side. All the thugs are on their side. So they've got a private setting now to take care of this. They pretty well could have gotten by with whatever they probably wanted to. Notice also Jesus said, but this is your hour and the power of darkness, the idea of sin, darkness, Satan's activity, and they being a part of that. So this was their hour to accomplish this. All right, we have John to finish up. Now, John, of course, writes later on, and it gives us wonderful insights into what Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not. Most scholars seem to say, the ones I read anyway, seem to say that Matthew, Mark, and Luke limited what they said because it could have been used in court against them. There were still issues when they actually sat and wrote it down. By the time John writes down, if it be correct, which I believe it is, that he wrote it down sometime after 90 A.D., Jerusalem's already destroyed. There's no longer any threat whatsoever. So not only does he name them by name, nobody's going to read it that's going to threaten them because they're all gone now. So we have that as part of the reason that it helps us understand why John tells us what he tells us. Now Judas who betrayed him also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So John actually, as an eyewitness, tells us a little bit more information. He met there with his disciples frequently. Judas knew exactly where to go. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. So John actually tells us a little bit more. Notice we have a band of soldiers that are brought into this. Who are these? Probably the guards of the temple, and it is very likely that some of them were, if not all of them, were Romans. So the soldiers themselves may have been Romans under the official use of the chief priests and the Pharisees. Some others say that it's just some of the guards of the temple. It doesn't actually specify, but using the name soldier usually indicates that it's actually some of the guards of the temple that the Romans had placed there.
The thing from the ESV there says he had procured a band of soldiers.
Yeah.
In the NIV, it says he is guiding a band of soldiers.
He was guiding them, yeah. Kind of a different aspect to it.
Procured means he paid for them.
Yeah. And probably that was not the case. He didn't probably have enough money to do so. But somebody may have paid them. I might have to go back and look that word up in the Greek and see what it actually says. Did the chief priest pay off the soldiers to come do this? That's an interesting question as well. They paid off Judas to come do this, so it may have been some money going back and forth as well. Deb?
Didn't they pay people to give false testimony
Oh, yeah.
at his trial?
That happens later on. They paid some of them off. Yeah. Well, there's money being passing from hand to hand.
Temple tax money.
Yeah. Notice we have lanterns as well, so that they had light in the dark places. You know, it's never mentioned that the apostles had lanterns with them. It's one of those little added things that's just kind of added in there. If the garden was as dark as it probably was at this time of the night, then we also would have the need for lanterns amongst the trees. We also, if the calendars are those who actually place this event at the particular time of year, it would have been almost full moon at this time, so it was a fairly lighted area anyway, but amongst the trees they probably did need lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, "Who do you seek?" Now John records for us that there was a whole lot more said in the garden than Matthew, Mark, or Luke describe. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke did not say anything about this. And that, again, leans back on the idea that they did not want to disclose more information, just the necessities were being recorded. But John has no such restraints whatsoever because it's so much later on. So he talks about a little bit of that, kind of fills in some of the gaps, if you will, and answers a couple of questions maybe that we've been able to pose. So Jesus initiates the conversation. They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with him. So we have Matthew and Mark saying he comes up and stands next to Jesus and kisses him, which was the sign given to them. Here it just states the fact that Jesus answered, "I am he." When Jesus said this to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Some have said, well, what is transpiring here exactly? Well, obviously, it is the power of Jesus being displayed in some way that they drew back and fell to the ground after he stated the words, "I am he." So he asked them again, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he, so if you seek me, let these men go." Notice the reason behind the first occasion when they fell back to the ground, and the second occasion. Why would Jesus display such power? The likelihood is that they would have seized the 11 apostles and everyone else there, but the power displayed enabled them not to be able to do such. The question also is very specific. Who do you look for? We're looking for Jesus. Well, then take me, leave them alone. And the power itself being displayed made it a frightening enough situation there that they were unwilling to go any further to try to capture anyone else in the scene but Jesus himself. So we have a little bit of power displayed here just simply by the statement of who Jesus is. He then, of course, tells them again and then basically commands them to let these men go, and the men scatter, of course. This was to fulfill the word that had been spoken, "Of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one." These are the words actually spoken in John chapter 17 in the prayer itself. So the statement is one, the prediction is one of Jesus' own. It is part of the prayer where he prays for his disciples that none would be lost except for the one. And of course we know that only the one was lost, and that it was a prediction in John chapter 17. So part of John chapter 17 is prophetic. When we studied that, we talked a little bit about that. But we have three sections of the prayer. We have, of course, for his glorification, which was prophetic of the events that were about to transpire. We have the apostles' prayer, which none of them would be lost, which is fulfilled here. And we have the other about the church and people coming to believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, that would also transpire. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus.
Why did they, I know you can't give me an answer, but it just seems to me like, why did they put his name in?
Probably because John wrote so many years later that it was no longer a threat. Where Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there was some kind of threat still. But we know that Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote their Gospels. Mark maybe a little bit later, Luke a little bit later too, Matthew being the first one writing. and Mark and Luke, but all of them writing before AD 70, before Jerusalem was destroyed. When John writes, Jerusalem is destroyed, there's no longer any threat.
Could it also be as kind of a validity to the story?
Oh, I'm sure it is on John's part, because he's read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is the suggestion. And if he'd read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John frequently includes things that Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not include. This is included here as well. So to make a full picture for us in putting the harmony together, John records for us that this was Peter. It also is significant because we're getting ready to enter, of course, the page where Peter denies him 3 times. But we want to see Peter's heart here. He took his sword and he drew it and he used it and was willing, you see. Now, when Jesus puts him down, which one of the records tells us that, Luke records that, then he puts his sword away. He doesn't ever draw it again. And from then you have the next step where he's invited in and he begins to do his denial.
I just wonder if it's possible that Malchus was still alive when John wrote that, and some,
Well,
people could ask him about it.
there was actually a record in, if I remember correctly, it is in Eusebius, that suggests that Marcus was in Ephesus when John wrote this. And that would have been written in the 3rd century. So there's no way to know for sure because some of his material is a little bit questionable, but it is stated that Malchus was one of the disciples that was in Ephesus that was catering to John and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the church there being one of the strongest ones in Asia Minor, that he was part of the priests that Acts records were, well, he was just a servant, but he was a part of that band that actually, because it says in Acts in one place where there were many priests that obeyed the gospel. So they were scattered out of Jerusalem because of the destruction of it. Before that transpired, he may have been one that left. And he'd been healed by Jesus. He would sure know that. So we have that as a possibility as far as information might go. You know that? Okay. So the band of soldiers, their captains, the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. It is significant that Jesus allowed them to bind him. You know, he gave himself. We notice that by what he said. Who do you look after? I am he. They took him, they bound him, the disciples run. And that's all John records of the event for us. Ooh, I got 15 minutes. How about that? Okay. So we have Jesus then. We come back to John's record. John continues to write about this, where Matthew, Mark, and Luke say nothing on this behalf. We have John continuing with the narrative once they leave the garden. Matthew, Mark, and Luke record the fact that the disciples leave. But there are 2 that do not. And that is now stated for us as we begin to enter into this. Now, John obviously records this from 2 standpoints. One, of course, the Spirit led him to record what he recorded, but he was an eyewitness to the event. And this is recorded here for us. We also then find out how Peter got into the courtyard, which is also recorded by John. First they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had been advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. So we know historically Annas was removed by the Romans as high priest because he committed murder, basically, or he authorized a murder that was not authorized by the Romans. In doing so, they removed him as high priest and they installed Caiaphas as high priest. Interestingly, we do have record. Josephus actually tells us that the people called Annas still the high priest, even after he had been disposed. We're going to see that actually in the text itself here. Caiaphas then is kind of just a figurehead because the Romans put him into place. Yet Caiaphas would have been the one that makes the accusations and brings it to the Romans because they're not going to recognize Annas, who had overstepped his bounds, basically. The year here, people make all kinds of interesting accusations, but this idea was that probably Annas was only penalized for a year. And so Caiaphas was only in place for that period of time when he was being penalized by the Romans. And then there's an indication historically that Annas took back his position as high priest. So we have, but the Jews recognized him as high priest all along. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the court of the high priest. But Peter stood outside the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. Who is this mysterious person? It's the same person that lays his head on Jesus' breast but doesn't name himself in his gospel. It is John. Lee.
I suggest that John is known to the high priest, so possibly the servant was known to John,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the reason he had that information in his gospel.
Because he's there.
Because because he was the one that went into the room, he knew the people there.
Yeah.
So he could identify them by name. And
Yep.
where the others were running away hiding, and they didn't really see what was going on, or maybe were not aware of who was who.
Well, that explains Marcus. He may have not, nobody else may have known exactly in that picture, but they do say it's the servant of the high priest. Matthew, Mark, and Luke both record that. Protecting Peter seems to be the indication of why Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't say him by name, but yet indicate that whom everybody else was there would have known in that setting. John does seem to be the only prospect of the 12 that would be in this position to actually enter into the court itself. We don't know what position John held. It doesn't actually tell us, but to be able to go openly into the high priest area means that probably he was of some note, simply because they don't try to arrest him. They don't try to do anything with John whatsoever. He just is a bystander. He's free because he gets to go out to the courtyard, talk to the person that keeps the gate, let Peter in. They're not going to deal with John, even though there seems to be in the previous setting some reason for them to want to try to arrest the rest of them. But he seems to be able to walk right with them without any fear of being chastised at all. Now, Peter, on the other hand, is going to be chastised by those out in the courtyard. John never is. So it suggests he held some kind of position. What kind of position? Never mentioned that I'm aware of in anything that's written. But he is able to come and go, and he seems to have firsthand information of what takes place in these trials.
You know, he was a businessman,
Yeah.
and he was rather successful, and his fame probably well known.
There's no way to know. Having done, maybe business, maybe there is some connection that we're unaware of. Maybe there is even the possibility. One writer I read said there's a possibility that he may have been related to some of them. There's no way to know. How would you know that they're related or not? But a lot of them were. That.
Also Jesus' cousin.
Yeah, and he's also Jesus' cousin, so you got kind of an interesting. But a lot of them are interrelated too, so it's hard to say. There may be some of them here that were likewise. We also know, let us also remember, let's not forget, that not everybody in the high priest and in the Sanhedrin were totally against Jesus. We have Nicodemus, and he shows up later on at the cross. He obviously was a part of the Sanhedrin, and he probably was also part of some of these settings. He couldn't do anything about what they were doing, but there appears to be some others that were not all on board with crucifying Jesus. They were just in the minority to such an extent they were incapable of doing anything about it, but that they went and hid does not also seem to be the case. They probably were a part of what was going on in the area. That servant girl at the door said to Peter, you also are not one of these men's disciples, are you? And he said, I am not. Now, John does not record for us all three I am nots. Matthew, Mark, and Luke do that for us. But here, John does record that. But John does record, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when we read that section, when he denies them, they seem to be in close proximity to each other. John indicates that there was a little bit of time that transpired in there, more than just 1, 2, 3, and cock crows. This seemed to indicate that first he tells this lady, I'm not. We got one denial. And then he kind of mulls around in the courtyard of this particular area. So we have that given to us by John, just kind of indicating there was a period of time that goes on here that is not recorded by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. So he comes into the courtyard, makes himself at home around the coal fire.
Seems kind of interesting that a servant girl is keeping watch on who enters the courtyard.
That is kind of interesting. I don't know any reason why or not or for or against. Maybe the men were too involved or something.
She was good with the sword.
Maybe, I don't know.
Wouldn't it have been her job to wash feet as they came into the area?
I don't know. Might have been.
That would seem logical.
Yeah.
Or she might have just been a precocious little girl who wanted to hear.
Just stated, she just spoke up, that's for sure. Yeah. The high priest then questioned Jesus about the disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all Jews came together. I have said nothing in secret. And we know by the record and by our study that the Pharisees always, and the Sadducees and the scribes were always coming and challenging him, and they were there, they heard the message, they saw the miracles, they were involved in all these things. Obviously, they went back and reported these things to the high priest. This was not unknown. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said. It appears that the high priest was trying to have him implicate himself. He says, ask them. When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, is that how you answer the high priest? Wanting him to incriminate himself. He said, why don't you ask everybody else? Everybody else knows exactly what I was teaching. And so we have Jesus, for the first time, being struck. I don't know that we ever, I don't know that I ever openly recognized, I don't know when I did, but that this was the first strike here. You know, we emphasize the cats of nine tails, what the Romans do, the floggings, and all these things. But can we imagine the official, if you will, the officer, striking the Son of God? There it is for the first time. Jesus answered him, if what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. So it appears, anyway, he didn't get struck anymore, and Annas just shoos him out to Caiaphas. It appears, by the way John writes this, that Annas and Caiaphas, of course, are in total cahoots. They know exactly what they're planning on doing. It had already been pre-decided whenever they paid Judas the money. So all the events that are transpiring were taking place in order of what had been decided by them. It's also important to recognize that Annas was the high priest according to law, old law. Caiaphas was not. So it is fitting that the bona fide high priest be the one that accused him first. This indicates an Old Testament connection in the idea that how they rejected him. The high priest of God rejects him.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Wasn't this at a time when Rome was appointing the high priest and they weren't Levites anyway?
Well, there were Levites, and they were still tending the temple. The Romans had their finger in all of it.
But
Okay.
they were, at what point did the Romans, I thought I read somewhere that the Romans were,
Well, that's their idea of getting Caiaphas in there. Annas was still the bona fide high priest, and he was still bloodline, it appears, anyway.
so there wouldn't be a new high priest until that particular high priest died.
Correct. Annas would remain the high priest. And so that's why in the statement here it says the high priest, even though the Romans had put Caiaphas in as their puppet, if you will. So Annas was still, in the eyes of the people, the high priest by lineage in that type of a setting. And he then, of course, would not give his high priesthood off until he actually died, and then his son would get the high priesthood if that was going to be the case. Caiaphas was the puppet, and where Annas normally, as the high priest, would have made accusations and passed it on to the Romans, he was not allowed to because he'd been deposed because of what he'd done before. Annas was quite a ruthless character, but from whatever we can figure on him. And that brings us down to the hurried trial by Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, who mock and buffet him. I think it's fitting that Annas, officer, strikes him first, and then, of course, it proceeds to more striking, more verbal abuse, and so on by the bona fide leaders of the Jewish people. Brought to Caiaphas, brought to the Sanhedrin, mocked, buffeted, but because Annas, it's kind of ironic, and I would say it's probably by the very insight of God himself, Annas appears to be, or before he was disposed of by the Romans, he had made several accusations and had several people stoned. If he had been high priest, he might well have had the gall to try to have Christ stoned. But that, of course, would not have fulfilled Scripture. So having Annas moved out of the way and Caiaphas put in, and the Romans having taken an upper hand, that's why Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin were unwilling to try to take it upon themselves to kill the Christ. They then say, we need to take it to the Roman official. Otherwise, I'm not sure that it would have transpired that way. So the whole scene, of course, is controlled by prophecy and by God, and making sure every little thing takes place. Lee.
In that situation where Christ is actually struck, it's like it shows the anger and the hatred.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, oh, we read it and you read along and everything, but you have to really be there to see the emotion and the passion of the people who love Jesus and are with him in the garden, and then the people who hate him and are taking him to the high priest, and then the soldier or person employed by the high priest is like, he's there saying, you like he just backhands him. Because he was angry that Jesus disrespected the high priest. And it's like that feeling, that passion, and that hatred is all right there in that one event.
Well, you see that with the Apostle Paul as well later on, that he gets struck and unjustly, and because he disagreed, basically. And so he also then speaks up and says, have I not spoken the truth? And he actually placates the Pharisees and Sadducees against each other in that particular occasion in the book of Acts. But yeah, their jealousies, their angers, their hanging on to power, all this is displayed in some of these scenes very openly. Annas was very rich, and he had stolen money right out of the temple treasury. I mean, it was just there. Even Josephus tells us that all those priests during that period of time were all ruthless. And they were in the pocket. They were paying off the soldiers. They were paying off the Romans. Anything to make a dollar. Didn't care about the people. On and on and on and on and on.
It just sounds like a lot of treachery.
Yeah, there is. And there's only a few that are not. Like Nicodemus is not. Clearly, there were some priests. We have one or two mentioned early on in when Jesus is born that are not a part of this. They're still trying to do what's right. But the majority of them have all been corrupted, and the money had corrupted them all. They had given, Jesus confronts them on several occasions, which we've studied a few times, where they were giving the money to the temple treasury instead of to their old people, kicking the old people out. Then they were pilfering the money out of the treasury, and it was the biggest melody. Then you got all the money changers inside the temple court. That was all illegal. All of it anti-Old Testament teaching, anything, They were squalling the people. They were, they were bringing, according to Malachi, they were bringing in diseased animals and all this kind of stuff to be sacrificed. I mean, the biggest mess that could possibly be imagined in this type of setting, all in the name of God, And so when the Son of God comes on the picture, just opposite to everything that they stand for, you can see the anger escalating all the way up to this point.
They're caught.
Yeah.
Red-handed.
Well, and they don't even realize how caught they are, because we're, if we put this at 33 AD, we're talking 30 years, 35 years, and the complete demise of the whole Jewish system is wiped off the face of the earth by God through the Roman Empire. They had no idea how close the end was to all of this. The whole thing was going to come to a screeching halt, and the Romans were going to do it.
I mean, if you reflect that age to our age, it's kind of terrifying.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. Any other thought? Well, good. I went over about 3 minutes. How about that? Can't beat that. Anything else we want to mention tonight? Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for our time, and we're always blessed by it, the fellowship and study and sharing of ideas. We're thankful for what Jesus endured, the great blessing of what he endured. We're thankful that he had the ability, the power, and the love for us that he did. We ask you, Lord, to be with us as we leave this place and bring us together again around your table. In the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.